Welcome to Reasonable Religion. Today we'll be discussing 4 reasons why science and religion are compatible. First reason, science is actually a product of religion. The very reason science is a thing to begin with, if you trace the history and development of science, because there is design and organization and order in the world, that means that if we go and experiment on the world, we're going to find consistency. And the idea that there is consistency is the theory and the fundamental notion behind the scientific method, the repeatability of experiments. But if you trace it back even further, you see that it is an exploration of the universe, of the God-given, God-created world that made scientists initially want to discover that world. The notion was that the world has information to give humanity. And so you go and explore that world. Nowadays, we have something of an internalized psychological interpretation of the world where we give the world meaning. But where science initially came out of is this notion that the universe, the world, and its exploration has something to offer humanity, and humanity has something to learn from that design and that order and that organization and the logic within the world. Number 2, it has always been the case until recently, and when I say recently, I'm talking about a couple hundred years, that science and religion have been understood as being compatible. The very idea that the two are at odds is recent. Perhaps there have been religious fundamentalists on one side of the aisle, and there have been scientists on the other side of the aisle sort of fabricating this new dilemma and this new war between science and religion. But rest assured, the majority of human history has believed that the two are completely congruent. And the reason for this leads us to point number 3, that science answers the how and religion answers the why. They're exploring 2 different fields, the same universe, the same reality, the same truths, but different dimensions, different angles. They both complement each other and they need each other. So science explains the mechanism behind any process, whereas religion won't explain the mechanism behind the process, but might try to answer why that process is there in the first place, or what that process implies for humanity, whether it's beneficial, whether it's harmful, whether it's deleterious, or whether it's for human flourishing. These questions of the why and how a person and how humanity might interact with that mechanism is the question of religion. Whereas science simply stops at explaining how something works. Lastly, science and religion both require 3 things: evidence, interpretation, and faith. Now you might be surprised by some of those. Let me explain. It's obvious that science requires evidence. It might also be obvious that science requires interpretation, but it's important to understand that all science is interpreted. So there are given facts, and there are experiments, and there's data, but the data is pretty useless, and you can't really communicate the data unless you interpret it to some extent. And even if you have raw data that is entirely uninterpreted, humans naturally file that information into their already organized worldview. So there's a process of interpretation that occurs once we hear specific data. So to think that there's no interpretation in science is false. Lastly, science requires faith. There are questions that inherently cannot be answered and cannot be reproduced. There are subjects that evade being proven or disproven. For example, the creation of the universe. If you are a strict materialist and do not believe that there's anything beyond the body and that God does not exist, and you want to think about how the world was created, you must necessarily believe that all things came into existence out of nothing on their own. That takes arguably more faith than to believe that a person with an intelligent mind created the universe with order. At the same time, religion requires evidence. For example, in Christianity, if Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead and didn't appear to people on the earth for 40 days, there wouldn't be witnesses, there wouldn't be a movement, there wouldn't be a continuation of Christianity. If there was no evidence for the experience of Christianity, so people attesting to it working, being transformed or being affected by the practices or the truths that are carried therein, then there wouldn't be a Christianity. There has to be some level of evidence and experience. There has to be interpretation, of course. Everything requires interpretation. From the moment the Bible was written, it required interpretation. And it requires faith, of course, and that doesn't require too much explanation. But to think that religion requires faith alone is also false. And it feeds into this false notion that science and religion are at odds. So at the ends of the spectrum, science requires faith and religion requires evidence. They both require both. Science and religion are compatible. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Leave comments. Let me know what other videos you'd like to watch. Thank you for all the support, and I will see you at the next video.